the decision that changed the bloodline. Every dynasty carries a moment so quiet, so deeply personal, that history almost misses it. No war, no public decree, just a choice made in private. One that rewrites the future of an entire bloodline without ever announcing itself. This story matters today because power is often inherited, but destiny is not. Families that rule for generations survive not by repeating themselves, but by knowing when repetition becomes decay. And for one sheik, the future of his lineage would hinge on a decision no advisor was prepared to hear. It began during preparation for succession. On paper, everything was flawless. The lineage was secure, the expectations clear. The next generation had been shaped carefully, trained to preserve continuity rather than question it. Council spoke confidently of stability, of legacy protected, of a future that looked comfortingly familiar. But as he reviewed the plans, a fracture appeared. He noticed how often competence was confused with conformity, how loyalty was measured by obedience rather than judgment, how the next generation had learned how to perform leadership without ever being asked why leadership existed at all. The bloodline was strong, but it was narrowing. The first unsettling thought arrived without warning. What if preserving the bloodline exactly as it was the greatest risk of all? He began observing quietly. Private conversations, small decisions, moments of pressure, and what he saw confirmed his fear. The heirs knew the rules, but not the responsibility behind them. They knew the rituals, but not the weight. They had inherited certainty without earning context. The reveal came during a closed family council meant to finalize succession roles. As expectations were outlined, he realized something irreversible. If he remained silent now, the bloodline would continue, but leadership would hollow over time. The dynasty would survive in name, but weaken in purpose. That was the moment the decision took shape. Not about power, not about control, but about whether the future of the bloodline would be protected by tradition alone or strengthened by transformation. And once that question surfaced, there was no returning to the safety of silence. The thought refused to stay theoretical. Once planted, it shaped how he saw every interaction within the family. He noticed which voices were encouraged and which were quietly sidelined, which qualities were rewarded and which were merely tolerated. Intelligence was praised, obedience was expected, but courage, the courage to question, was subtly discouraged. He recognized the pattern because he had lived it. The dynasty had taught survival through alignment. Each generation refined the script, polishing away friction until leadership became performance. It worked until it didn't. The system produced stability, but not resilience. And resilience, he knew, was what the future would demand. The conflict emerged when he shared his concerns privately with a trusted relative. The response was immediate resistance. Questioning succession, he was told, invited instability. Unity depended on predictability. Change within the bloodline was dangerous. The words echoed familiar arguments, ones he had used himself in earlier years. But now they felt insufficient. The turning point came when he reviewed a confidential assessment of emerging risks, technological, cultural, geopolitical. The future outlined was unforgiving to rigid systems. Leadership shaped by imitation would falter. The dynasty's strength, once adaptive, was at risk of becoming ceremonial. He realized then that the decision before him was not about who would lead next. It was about how leadership would be defined. He began testing the boundaries subtly. He introduced complexity into discussions, invited dissent, presented scenarios without clear answers. Some heirs engaged, others deflected. A few struggled visibly when certainty dissolved. These reactions revealed more than any examination ever could. The revelation was unsettling. Not every member of the bloodline was prepared to carry leadership forward as the world changed. And some who appeared most prepared were the least adaptable. The decision sharpened. Protecting the bloodline now meant risking its comfort. And as family gatherings grew tense and conversations careful, he understood that whatever he chose next would fracture assumptions that had held for generations. Because dynasties do not fear external threats most. They fear choosing transformation over tradition. And that fear was now standing directly in his path. The tension reached a point where silence itself became a decision. Family gatherings felt measured, conversations restrained by an unspoken awareness that something fundamental was shifting. The bloodline, once unified by predictability, now sensed uncertainty moving beneath its surface. He decided it was time to confront the truth directly, not publicly, not ceremonially, but within the inner circle where lineage and legacy were shaped. He convened a private council of family elders and future heirs, framing the meeting not as a challenge, but as a reckoning. The atmosphere was heavy with expectation. Everyone knew the succession was no longer a formality. He spoke with clarity, not accusation. He described the risks facing the future: rapid change, fragile legitimacy, leadership tested not by ritual but by consequence. He explained that continuity without adaptability was not preservation, it was decline. And then he delivered the truth that fractured the room. Succession, he said, would no longer be determined by birth order alone. The reaction was immediate. Shock first, then disbelief. Some elders argued that such a move would destabilize the dynasty. Others warned it would invite rivalry and resentment. A few accused him of abandoning tradition entirely. But beneath the objections lay fear, not chaos, but of losing certainty. He listened, then asked a question that cut through the resistance. If leadership is inherited without earning judgment, how long before the bloodline survives only in name? Silence followed. The conflict deepened as he outlined a new framework. Lineage would still matter. Tradition would still guide. But leadership would now require demonstrated capacity, decision-making under pressure, ethical clarity, and the ability to adapt when certainty collapsed. The bloodline would not be replaced. It would be tested. Some heirs reacted with determination, others with resentment. A few withdrew entirely, and in those reactions, the truth became unavoidable. The dynasty had long mistaken entitlement for readiness. The most difficult moment came when a favored successor, one assumed to be inevitable, struggled openly under scrutiny. The realization rippled through the room. Appearances had masked fragility. Confidence had hidden dependence on structure rather than judgment. He felt the weight of the decision press harder than ever. This was no longer reform. It was rupture, yet he knew retreat would be worse, because protecting the bloodline from discomfort would only guarantee its irrelevance. As the meeting ended, the family dispersed in uneasy silence. No resolution had been announced, no successor named, but the old certainty was gone, and in its place stood a future that would be earned, not assumed. The dynasty had crossed a point of no return. What remained was to face the final consequence of that choice. The consequences unfolded slowly, not as rebellion, but as reckoning. Conversations within the family changed tone. Certainty dissolved into reflection. Those who had relied on inheritance alone now faced the uncomfortable reality of evaluation, and those who had long stood in the shadows began stepping forward with quiet resolve. The climax arrived months later, during a final succession review. This time, no assumptions filled the room. Each candidate had been tested, not through ceremony, but through real decisions made under pressure. Some had risen, others had faltered, and one outcome, though controversial, became impossible to deny. The future leader was not the most obvious choice, but they were the most prepared. The decision landed heavily. For some, it felt like loss. For others, liberation. The bloodline had not been broken, but it had been reshaped. Legacy was no longer guaranteed by birth alone. It was earned through judgment, responsibility, and clarity. Publicly, the transition was framed with unity and respect for tradition. Privately, the dynasty absorbed a truth it had long avoided. Survival in a changing world demanded more than continuity. It demanded courage from within. The resolution came not in applause, but in stability. Rivalries faded as legitimacy solidified. The chosen successor carried authority not because it was assumed, but because it had been proven. And the dynasty, once rigid, found new resilience in its willingness to evolve. Standing alone afterward, he reflected on the cost. The decision had strained relationships. It had invited criticism. It had disrupted comfort. But it had also secured something far more valuable than harmony: relevance. The bloodline would endure not as a relic, but as a living institution capable of growth. And in that truth, he understood the final lesson. Legacy is not what you protect from change. It is what you prepare to survive it. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. The